When you look at the international protection occupancy numbers in Ireland over the period of time in which Minister McEntee has been the Minister for Justice, you could be forgiven for thinking that perhaps she has been the Minister for increasing the numbers in international protection in Ireland. I can't say for certain that that is what her role has been, but over the next half an hour, I want to alert you to a number of very concerning elements to the story of asylum seeking in Ireland. If you joined the conversation around international protection in Ireland in 2024, you would assume that Ireland's asylum crisis is the same as it is across the world and across Europe. And because of the scale of this crisis, it proves that we cannot do this alone and that we need to join the EU Migration Pact.
Today, in the context that we're discussing this pact today, we see more people on the move than any time since World War II. War, conflict, famine, persecution, climate change and poverty. The pact is the way for us to deal with and respond to what is a global, a significant challenge. The pact will address the key inefficiencies that are in our system, and we have a system that doesn't work as it should because it was built for much less people. We had a lot less people coming here, 3,500 applicants a year, whereas last year we had 13,000 people applying for international protection.
This European Pact provides us with the tools that we need, the laws that we need, the structures that we need.
Ireland experiences high levels of secondary movement of people who move from other safe countries before applying for asylum here. And because of this, the reforms of the Pact are essential for us.
What's clear is that our system was not designed to deal with the volume of applications far lower than we're currently dealing with, or it was designed to deal with situations far lower than we're dealing with now.
So the government's pitch in 2024 is pretty clear. The numbers have increased massively, and now we need an external system from the EU Migration Pact, in order to have the systems, the tools, the resources to deal with this crisis. But this wasn't always the case. The asylum crisis and the migrant crisis in particular peaked in 2015, and we didn't see any of it. So why is it that we're now no longer removed from the crisis? And just to prove that we were removed from the crisis, we can hear from the same people speaking about Ireland being removed from the crisis. Up until very recently, it's been common knowledge across Europe and across our political class that we were almost completely removed from the migrant crisis.
Ceann Comhairle, in relation to migration, as you know, Ireland has been somewhat removed from the full effect of recent migration or mass migration.
We are a little bit removed from it here in the Republic of Ireland because of our geographical location.
Migration, I suppose, it is one of the biggest challenges. It's yes, one that we're removed from, but one that we certainly don't think we should remove ourselves from the conversation, and the support that we provide, the solidarity that we show and the cooperation among member states. Ireland, we could say, I think, is removed from the full effects of the mass migration inflows because of our geographic location.
We in Ireland are not engaged in this debate over migration and asylum into the European Union. That may be for geographic reasons, it may be for other reasons.
The 2015 Syrian migrant crisis is shown on this map, the migration routes that occurred. As you might imagine, as you probably know, that the heaviest hit by this migrant crisis was in the region of Italy, Greece, and some other countries that voluntarily opened up their doors, like Germany. Angela Merkel let in over 1 million migrants in the space of a year. So because of the Dublin regulation, which Helen McEntee will explain next how that works, these migrants had to apply in their first port of entry into a safe EU country. Ireland's really far away. There's no way that we'll be the first port of entry here. And that is why Ireland was completely isolated and removed from the crisis. In the next clip, Helen McEntee will explain what the Dublin regulation is.
The Dublin regulation itself provides that the country that played the primary part in a person's entry into the Union is responsible for examining an application for protection. It also provides for the applicant to be transferred to that EU member state.
Here are Ireland's stats for international protection in 2018. This is what being removed from the crisis looks like. As you can see, Syria is our third most common applicant. And we didn't reject them at all. We only rejected 1.75% of them. But our top applicants were from countries like Albania and Georgia, and we rejected them. They're safe countries. We actually listed Georgia as a safe country in 2018 under Charlie Flanagan of Fine Gael as Justice Minister. You can also see Nigeria here. We reject them at 94%, and Zimbabwe also a high percent. As you might imagine, countries that felt the brunt of the migrant crisis weren't so happy that we, number one, got no numbers, and also that any numbers that might have occurred or might have happened in Ireland, we could send them back under the Dublin regulation. We could completely insulate ourselves from the crisis, and Neil Richmond here will explain that that wasn't so popular.
We speak to continental colleagues who are living, be it in Greece or Spain or Italy, they can sometimes come with it from a very different position, and it doesn't necessarily come with political ideology, but more practical. And I think I would hope to think there's agreement in this committee that Ireland can and should do so much more to address this. And Claire, I was taken by your reference, of course, to the Dublin Treaty, and it's very difficult in European circles when you see people getting up and giving out yards about Dublin, and you have to separate. Of course, they're not talking about our home, they're talking about this treaty specifically.
So while immigration and asylum wasn't really a topic of conversation that much people in Ireland heard of until 2022, 2023, it was the number one issue in mainland Europe and for the European Union for years. And that means that this pact has been a high priority for people like the Minister of European Affairs, where Helen McEntee was before she was Minister for Justice, and the European Union and the European Commission especially has been working on this for a very long time, as both Simon Harris and Helen McEntee alluded to in 2024 when pitching the European Migration Pact.
The pact before us is a united effort from Europe, after excruciating work and negotiation over a long period of time, to ensure that we have full control of and responsibility for our European borders, and that we have a system in place that works across the European Union for once and for all.
This has been discussed for 8 years at a European level, and nearly every aspect of the pact has been available for people to engage in.
So Helen McEntee makes it clear that the EU Migration Pact has been worked on for 8 full years, and so we've had plenty of time to engage in it. But you'll also remember that her pitch for us joining the pact was on the basis of our asylum crisis, which we completely avoided through the peak of the European asylum crisis. But now we have an asylum crisis since Helen McEntee became Justice Minister. I think what people in Ireland might find surprising is that the desire to join the EU Migration Pact existed in Irish politicians long before the migrant crisis or the asylum crisis hit Ireland. The next clip is somewhat lengthy. It's about 5 minutes of Irish politicians wanting to join an EU Migration Pact years before we had an asylum crisis to justify it.
I believe that we all have an obligation. I think that obligation has to be spread across Europe. I think it has to be done in the short term rather than in the longer term. I think quite enough of discussion has taken place.
I think the Dublin regulation is inadequate and needs to be reviewed and refined. I think it has to include explicit responsibilities being shared in the European Union. We need also to agree things at European level, in my opinion. For an example, I think that there should be some form of quota distribution of refugees based on objective criteria, be it GDP per capita or total population, and combination of both obviously would be part of it, but there should be a fair distribution. It may be difficult, as has been suggested by this committee, to do it, but that's what parliamentarians are for. We have to do it. I think it's easy to say, as you might say, you're talking from outside and not dealing with political realities. Maybe not. But this is a political reality that's not going away.
There will be a lot of debate in relation to trying to get a collective agreement on the EU collective approach to migration. I hope it will involve burden sharing across the European Union.
Work on solidarity and burden sharing, however, and efforts to reform the European asylum system, including the Dublin Convention, are still difficult.
We need to play our role in the overall context. I know the words have been used, burden sharing. So we're ready and willing to play our role.
There's obviously looking at the Dublin Regulation and the European Common Asylum to try and reform that. Our view has always been that a comprehensive Europe-wide solution is necessary to respond effectively to the mass migration flows.
What is needed is a humanitarian response There must also be burden sharing on, and an openness to the proposal for mandatory quotas. We also need a common European asylum policy, and it's obvious to everyone that the Dublin regulation is hopelessly out of date and not fit for purpose anymore.
It is an issue that is too big for nation states.
And the Taoiseach needs to bring this message loud and clear and to enact this across government also, that we need a pan-European approach to this issue. We cannot expect a small few member states to shoulder the entire burden. We have to do an awful lot more to show that we're serious about playing our part in dealing with this crisis.
We have said that we would play our part in terms of burden sharing.
We acknowledge that there is a need to reform the common European asylum system, and we intend to play a constructive role in finding shared solutions that work for all member states.
Work on solidarity and burden sharing, however, and efforts to reform the European asylum system, including the Dublin Convention, are still difficult, and there's been no real progress in this area.
Membership of the EU is not just about enjoying the benefits. It's also about taking shared responsibility for our part of the world and pooling our efforts into common solutions for the problems that we collectively face.
These include regional disembarkation platforms or control centres, reform of the common European asylum system, especially the Dublin regulation, under which asylum applications are assessed in the member states where the migrant first enters the EU. From an Irish point of view, we are very keen to find a consensus based on a balance of responsibility but also solidarity. The number of illegal migrants coming through the European border has decreased by about 95% since its peak only a few years ago, and so what we need to do now is make sure that policies for the future work, that they support the people that they're supposed to, and that obviously we have cooperation among member states to try and implement them, which is often the hardest thing to do. There's obviously looking at the Dublin Regulation and the European Common Asylum to try and reform that. Our view has always been that a comprehensive Europe-wide solution is necessary to respond effectively to the mass migration flows.
And the third is burden sharing, and we are committed to burden sharing and solidarity when it comes to the migration crisis. We're asking all the time for other European countries to demonstrate solidarity for us when it comes to Brexit, and I think therefore when it comes to problems that they face, such as mass migration or illegal migrations, we have to assist them as well.
So I think that makes it clear that the Irish politicians Leo Varadkar, Helen McEntee, Simon Coveney and many others wanted Ireland to join an EU Migration Pact long before Ireland had an asylum crisis. And the other thing that they wanted to do, obviously, was to reform or potentially remove the Dublin Convention, the thing that predominantly, or I guess majorly, kept Ireland away from the 2015 migrant crisis. Helen McEntee also acknowledged there that the 2015 migrant crisis, the peak of the migrant crisis in the European Union, had decreased by 95%, I think she said it was. So there wasn't even a current migrant crisis to deal with. She was looking to reform the system for any future migrant crises. You might ask yourself, why does Ireland want to take on this problem? Why would they want to bring this political difficulty on them? I would argue that I think it's because of what I'm going to show you next. For all the talk of humanitarian obligations and the need to do the right thing, I have come to believe that the main thing driving the EU Migration Pact is the European Commission's desire to prevent a rise of nationalism. What they've seen and what will be shown in the next clip is that anywhere where a lot of migrants have arrived, they've seen this rise of populism, as they call it, these right-wing Eurosceptic politicians. And Irish politicians and politicians across Europe on the left, and they'll call themselves the centre, and the European Commission are terrified of this threatening the European project.
Many Europeans and many European voters clearly fear a return to those previous levels of migration. And the political reality is that some populist and anti-immigration parties have been elected as a result of that.
Migration is also one of the great global issues of the day, as we can see from observing US politics right now. As a result, a new wave of populism has emerged in the politics of Italy, Hungary, Poland and Austria, where right-wing parties are now in the ascendancy.
I am concerned about Euroscepticism and the role Eurosceptics are playing in this xenophobic theme that's emerging at the present time. I think it's dangerous. I think it is something that Europe should address. And as you know, Chairman, we've discussed this here and we intend to deal with this in a report to the committee. And I think it is related to this subject, because I believe that if Europe doesn't address these subjects, each country with its own respective share of responsibilities right throughout Europe, if they don't do that, then the Europe as we envisaged, the Europe that we thought about, and the traditional Europe that we saw evolve over the last 60, 65 years or so, will disappear. And if it does, then there will be consequences, and the consequences won't be nice.
We're unfairly asking certain countries to take too much of the burden here. And this was, of course, the problem for Italy in the first place, which is why politics responded by electing someone who was advocating for a hardline message on migration. So we need to help Italy, but we also need to ensure that burden and that responsibility is shared.
So with Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil both fearing the end of the European Union as they know it, threatened by a rise of populist nationalism that could lead to economic powerhouses like Germany and France leaving the Union and risking the entire project. Finally, in September of 2020, the EU Migration Pact that we didn't debate until 2024, if you want to call it a debate, the pact was finally published in September of 2020. We were all locked in our houses at the time, you might remember. But here is how Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil leadership welcomed that news.
The Commission is due to publish a major new proposal on reforming the European Union migration and asylum system, a new pact on migration and asylum, in the coming weeks. And we will work closely with our EU partners to progress efforts.
A new pact on migration and asylum has been published today by the European Commission. It aims to provide a comprehensive approach to migration management that is sustainable, humane and effective, and which can work well on a day-to-day basis and withstand current pressures as well as the challenges of the future. Minister McEntee welcomes the publication of the new pact, which will strengthen the EU's capacity to respond to challenges that migration poses and minimise the impact that it has on lives of those who migrate and the communities in which they move.
The European Commission in the last number of weeks has introduced a new proposed pact on migration and asylum, which it is hoping to be able to gain support for across the European Union. Certainly Ireland will play a very constructive role in helping them to do that, so that we can ensure that there is genuine burden sharing across the EU in terms of countries making a contribution, as I believe we should, to the migration challenges, and there are numerous ways in which we can do that, but no country should be able to opt out.
Simon Coveney's emphatic statement, no country should be able to opt out, that really fits the tone of how the debate went in Ireland once the pact was published in 2020. Their conversations largely revolved around how they can use Article 9 or perhaps a treaty change within the European Union to force countries like Hungary and Poland to opt in to the Migration Pact. There was no conversation around whether or not the Irish people wanted to opt in. The Irish people already had an opt-out secured through Lisbon 2, which, we rejected Lisbon 1 on the basis of losing our sovereignty. Obviously, our sovereignty is a big deal to the Irish people. It wasn't a concern at all to the political class in Ireland. And just to show how much the decision was already made before any debate happened, I want to show you this next clip. Michael Schotter of the European Commission, a senior, I think he's a director of the European Commission, explained how the mandatory solidarity, which is EU speak for migrant quotas, are going to work. At the time, Ireland in 2020, we only received 1,500 applications. And as you've seen in the previous data, the applications that we did get, we can usually just reject them because they're from safe countries, or because of the Dublin Convention, we didn't have to take them. But listen to how Fine Gael's Joe McHugh thanks Michael Schotter for explaining to him how our new asylum system is going to work.
This sets out a common framework at the beginning, sets out rules on responsibility, and also sets out a solidarity mechanism. And member states, by this solidarity mechanism, will be bound to act to show solidarity to each other. So solidarity is not optional, it's compulsory. That's a very, very important point I want to emphasise, this mandatory solidarity component. We can't compromise either on the objective we want to achieve here, which is to provide effective support to the member state that needs that support. And that will most likely be the member states that are obviously geographically exposed, and now we've seen that are rather constantly under pressure due to their geographical position.
Michael, but we're grateful for your time this morning, and certainly your insights and your experience in this area and your colleagues will be really important in mapping out a comprehensive new pathway for the way we deal with migration.
So with the decision seemingly already made that Ireland would opt in to the EU Migration Pact in 2020, there was also a conversation around whether or not the EU should have a treaty change. There was a concern that some countries would be able to opt out of the Migration Pact, and obviously that couldn't happen. So a conversation took place between people like Barry Andrews, Neil Richmond, Billy Kelleher, around a potential treaty change. Here are the notes of Barry Andrews. He kind of jokingly leaked them prior to the meeting. But you can see here conversations around the Migration Pact, the future of Europe and the Migration Pact are obviously closely interlinked. But there's an interesting conversation over whether or not the Irish people wanted more EU integration, and they weren't too sure.
Barry, I was very taken not just by your opening remarks, but your notes that you very kindly tweeted out last night. I'll take it as a whimsical comment. But one of the things I zoomed in very carefully you had written was treaty change ? And again, this is something we raised last week. Do you think it's time for a treaty change? Do you think it's time for a new European treaty? Bearing in mind, you and I both campaigned here in various referenda for European treaty, which were slightly difficult, to say the least.
There will be concerns around this idea that member states can simply opt out of resettlement and relocation by sponsoring returns. And I'm not sure that's exactly what's meant by EU solidarity around asylum.
I think the relationship that Irish people have with the EU is probably as good as it's ever been. And I think that's because we've seen the relevance of a positive impact of the EU. And unfortunately, that's just in relation to Brexit, because before that, all we ever heard was negative stuff from the EU and that the bowsies over there are making us do this, we don't want to do this, we don't want to do that. So I think we need to capitalise on this positive aspect and the positive disposition that Irish people have.
Senator Doherty's the difference between, I think we have to remember the difference between support for EU membership in Ireland and the support for EU integration. When people say there's 90% support for the EU in Ireland, we're thinking about support for membership, not necessarily for integration. So we need to go into those figures in a little bit more detail.
So Fine Gael's Regina Doherty was full sure that Irish people loved the EU and that should be used potentially for a treaty change. But interestingly, Barry Andrews of Fianna Fáil thought that she may be confusing or mixing up EU membership for EU integration. And we obviously didn't have a treaty. We didn't have another referendum to have a new treaty on the EU, so that didn't go ahead. But this segment here from Billy Kelleher, I think, is very enlightening. In this clip, Billy Kelleher actually condemns other countries for putting their national interests ahead of the interests of the Union. And interestingly, he says that he has more support for the European Commission, who are not elected by the people, than he does for the MEPs who he sees as holding back progress by representing the interests of their nations. Quite concerning for a man who's currently hired to represent Ireland's nations in the European Union.
You just see the resistance to the announcement by the Commission on the Asylum and Migration Pact from various countries. So it indicates that we are in a state of paralysis in Europe and unwilling to deal with it. Now, personally, I think that the Commission is very committed to trying to bring forward proposals. It did in the context of the Pact. I think that the Parliament is more open, but it is the Council that is clearly delaying and obfuscating any movement in the areas of migration and asylum, because they are very much focused on national interests and, playing to their domestic audience rather than looking at the broader humanitarian obligations that we have as a political union as well.
So it's quite telling that Billy Kelleher, an MEP with Fianna Fáil, can sit in a joint committee meeting in Irish government buildings and put down other people for putting their national interests first. That's very concerning. Just to recap what the EU Migration Pact is, it's explained quite well by Barry Andrews here, and it's good to get a reminder of what exactly is involved for the next section.
The pact is really about asylum rather than migration, and I make the point in my submission that they're two different things. In migration, people are leaving for a better life. With asylum, people are fleeing for their lives, and we need to make a clear distinction. And the pact is really mostly about asylum, and it tries to deal with the Dublin regulation and the lack of solidarity for those countries that are on the front line of irregular population movements into Europe in the south and in the east. And it does that in a couple of ways. But what it would mean for Ireland is possibly a relocation and resettlement system that would be much more fair, would be a much greater degree of solidarity.
So with all of Ireland's political class in Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael seemingly on board, I wanted to bring you back to the meeting that took place between Michael Shotter and the Joint Committee on European Affairs here in 2020. I think this is very concerning and also somewhat of a smoking gun in this story. Ireland didn't have an asylum crisis. The Dublin regulation that they're looking to reform or remove, that is largely what kept Ireland out of a migrant crisis. It is our number one tool against having to be involved in this crisis. Listen to how Michael Shotter informs our government to act now. This is in 2020. But listen to the emergency in his voice and the immediacy in Ireland needing to take action against a crisis and a preparation for a pact that we didn't experience yet.
We want this part of the future of Europe to become the present of Europe. So it's not something to be put to a very futuristic debate. We would like these proposals, as I said, to become that some of them are really, well, it's all urgently needed. So this future should become Europe's present. It's very, very urgently needed, and in that sense, I wouldn't put it into the more future forward-looking discussion. We need this to be put in place now, and I just want to make that point. And it is a priority. It's interconnected with a vision of the world, and also with the image that the European Union projects.
Now, the peculiar thing is, after this urgency and this immediacy projected by Michael Shotter to Ireland's Joint Committee on European Union Affairs, the debate drops off. There isn't any more debate. I think for around a year, the European Asylum Pact isn't even mentioned on the Oireachtas.ie debates. But what I want to show you now for the rest of this documentary is what I have come to believe, and is my political opinion. I cannot prove it to be true, but I believe a series of actions were taken to create a crisis of asylum in Ireland so that we could say that line that Helen McEntee used, that we cannot go it alone. And interestingly, Leo Varadkar used a very similar line when speaking to the European Parliament in 2018, when we certainly could go it alone. We didn't have an asylum crisis at the time. But what I want to show you first is the regularization of undocumented migrants. Nothing could be more attractive to somebody who wants to go to a country illegally than for them to become documented if they do it anyway. This was a scheme that took place in 2021. Interesting enough, I believe it was a Fianna Fáil bill, but it was enacted by a Fine Gael Justice Minister in Helen McEntee.
Migrants' Rights Centre Ireland estimates there are between 15 and 20,000 undocumented people living in Ireland, 2,000 to 3,000 of whom are children. The majority of those will be able to apply as long as they can show evidence of living here for the time period specified, 4 years residence and 3 years for those with children. People with an existing deportation order can apply, and applicants must meet standards regarding good character in relation to criminal records, although having convictions for minor offences will not result in disqualification.
They are working, they're paying taxes, their children are in our schools, they're part of the very fabric of our society, and without even knowing it, many of them are undocumented, and the huge strain and the pressure that I think places on them, their mental health and their ability to live their lives in the way that they want to. It's huge, and so I believe this is the right thing to do.
So this action took place in 2021, pretty unprecedented. And as you might imagine, that was obviously very attractive to anybody who would like to come to Ireland illegally. This is now a pro-illegal immigration country through this action. And it was endorsed by Ylva Johansson, who is quite a senior member of the European Commission. Obviously, the European Commission have wanted the European Migration Pact for a long time, so who knows what could be influencing her opinion on this.
Also, recently, I have learned about your recent initiative to regularize undocumented migrants in Ireland. We don't know, I guess, how many that will be, but as I understand, it could be up to 17,000 people. And I think this is really the right step to go. We have seen it also in other member states, but I think this is a bold step. And I really applaud this initiative because I think it's really good one.
The second act that I have come to suspect was taken in order to create a migrant crisis to clean up with the EU Migration Pact was the dramatic transformation of our rejection rates and the misuse of the humanitarian protection category. Here are Ireland's international protection stats for 2018. I think we saw them earlier, but as you can see, our top two countries are both safe origin countries, and we rejected them 99%, 97% for Georgia, 94% for Nigeria, and an overall 90% rejection rate. Roughly 3,500 applications in 2018. These stats are our 2020 stats. Interestingly enough, Georgia and Albania dropped off the top. I wonder were they responding to the high rejection rates? But overall rejection rate of 66%, numbers were down because of COVID. But look what happens after the EU Migration Pact is released and we've had that meeting with Michael Schotter. Suddenly, our overall rejection rate for 2021 is 5.5%. Numbers are slightly up. Our humanitarian protection rate is way up. And look at Nigeria and Georgia. Suddenly they're getting 14% rejection rates and 11% rejection rates. Zimbabwe, 6.9% rejection rates. This is a complete transformation of how we process these applications. And here in 2022, I believe you can start to see the fruits of these actions. Suddenly, we're up to 13,500 applications in 1 year. But they're not coming from Syria or Afghanistan or Venezuela like the migrants do in the EU. They're coming from the groups that we used to reject: Georgia, Algeria, Somalia, Nigeria, Zimbabwe. These are safe origin countries, and many of them went on to be listed as so. Georgia was already listed as a safe country since 2018. Just to show how out of whack these stats are in Ireland, these are Germany stats from 2022. Look at Georgia. They're still getting a 99.5% rejection rate in Germany. They're not going into humanitarian protection. And the bulk of their applications, as is the case in mainland Europe, are from Syria and Afghanistan. These people don't come to Ireland. And just in case there's a possibility that Germany is just really, really strict and not seeing Georgian persecution, here is France. Again, Afghanistan, the top country. Look at Georgia here, 95% rejection rates. Nigeria, 93% rejection rates. And these are just a speck in their overall numbers. By far and away, Afghanistan is their biggest origin country. And here we can look at Switzerland again. I'm sorry, Georgia, for singling you out, but you're just the best example to show the argument I'm making here. If you look at Georgia, 92% rejection rate. Only a small number of their applicants, because if you keep rejecting them, the numbers get smaller and smaller, like they were in Ireland before we lowered rejection rates. I think this graph shows just how out of whack Ireland's asylum system is from the rest of the EU's. So this shows the differences in numbers between January and June 2019 versus the same months in 2022. In Ireland, Georgians are up 290%, but they're down 5% across the EU. Look at Algeria, they're up 1,324% in Ireland, but they're down 29% across the EU. And similar numbers happen throughout these different origin countries throughout this whole graph. Look at Nigeria. Nigeria is up 237% in Ireland, but they're down 44% across the EU. They're getting rejected across the EU. The numbers are falling, but we're the only ones letting them in. So while Helen McEntee, Micheál Martin, Simon Harris and Simon Coveney are arguing that we should join the Migration Pact because of the volume of numbers coming to Ireland, ask yourself, if you were a fraudulent asylum seeker and you were considering going to Ireland or France, look at these numbers. Which one would you choose? 73% rejection rate in France or a 19% rejection rate in Ireland? The choice is obvious. The case for international protection in Ireland has always been on the basis that they can tell the difference between economic migrants and actual legitimate asylum seekers, and that's where the goodwill of the Irish people has been coming from. Listen to Simon Coveney making this argument in 2018 to Maddie McGrath.
But people who come to Ireland illegally are coming here either to claim asylum or because they're economic migrants. And we have systems to ensure that we can test the difference between both. And we should focus on those systems rather than kind of creating ambiguity or grey areas that play on people's fear.
So Simon Coveney there was warning Maddie McGrath about the dangers of conflating economic migrants with legitimate asylum seekers and assured him that we have the systems to tell the difference between both. And perhaps we did in 2018. But I think you'll see from the next clip that both Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil and even Rory O'Murchu of Sinn Féin are fully aware that Georgians, who for a long time were the biggest cohort in Ireland's international protection system, I think they're currently the second biggest. They're fully aware that they're economic migrants and that we're housing them, paying them, feeding them, doing everything for them under the guise of them being asylum seekers when they're actually economic migrants. In the following clips, there are two separate ambassadors of Georgia in the clips, and I think questions have to be asked as well if whether their European ascendancy has anything to do with this situation.
I think we're all in agreement that migration is a way of life. It's a necessity. You've said a significant amount of those refugees aren't necessarily asylum seekers that are coming into Ireland.
I was just interested in the reports of population decline in Georgia, and we noticed a lot of Georgians have come here in the past as well, looking for asylum, as you probably know, and refugee status.
So the Georgian immigration started most recently 30 years ago. And of course, the people are traveling for better life. They are traveling for better salaries. The economy is that matters, and that is economies that leads their decision.
We have had the meeting with the with the Department of Justice, and we have addressed this issue. And you are completely right. These are mostly economic migrants that seek to come to Ireland, and there are certain ideas that can help mitigate this problem.
Well, Aaron, the ambassador knows I have a particular interest in and is in the area of people coming from Georgia seeking asylum, and you know, to his credit, he has always acknowledged that these are predominantly economic migrants who are coming looking for an opportunity to work. But because of our system, there is no opportunities for them to come in and seek a work permit and contribute to society. In fact, they're coming in, they're seeking asylum, and they're costing the state a considerable amount of money, and at a time when we don't have capacity. And I'd just like to know what you're doing in relation to try and alleviate that pressure on our system, because it doesn't look good, as I said before, a country who is actively pursuing their application to be members of the EU to have the volume looking for asylum that you currently have. And I think, and I've said it before to my own colleagues, particularly in the Department of Enterprise, that we should be a lot more flexible in terms of workers' permits, in terms of giving people, particularly in sectors of our economy where we have issues in filling jobs, in the hospitality sector, in the haulage sector, in the construction sector. rather than forcing people to fake asylum.
Georgia is a safe origin country, so the accelerated procedure of considering the asylum applications is also helping there, because, for example, in Germany, the approval rate is just 0.1%.
So just for context, the Irish taxpayer is currently paying for, I think it's roughly 3,700 Georgians in international protection. So it seems that there's cross-party awareness that these are economic migrants, as they say themselves. I found it very funny there that Robert Troy of Fianna Fáil is asking the Georgians, what are they doing to protect our borders, where we're currently giving them an extremely low rejection rate. One minister from Georgia there said that in Germany, it's less than 1% recognition rate, as we saw in the previous slides. Obviously, they're coming to Ireland because they get a very different deal. The next pillar of what I've come to suspect was an action taken to induce more asylum seekers to come so that this EU Migration Pact could be sold to the Irish people is Helen McEntee not enforcing the law. That comes in a number of different shades, but the first one we'll look at is Helen McEntee not enforcing the Dublin Convention. You remember the Dublin Convention is largely why Ireland has or had so few asylum seekers, and it's something that they wanted to change with the EU Migration Pact. My thesis is the best way to prove that the Dublin Convention needs to be changed is to say that it's not working for Ireland at the minute. And you actually see Helen McEntee taking this angle with Michael McNamara, who I think is much too smart to try that kind of shite with.
In 2023, your department issued 188 transfer decisions. That means 188 cases where another country said, yes, we're responsible for processing this person, and yes, we'll take them back. Of the 188, you transferred 3. Can you explain that?
I suppose this just shows the inefficiency of the Dublin 3 system.
No, but it shows the inefficiency of your department. Another country said they'd take them back and accepted they would take them back and had responsibility. Your department transferred 3. What's the problem? So what's the problem in your department in implementing this Dublin 3 regulation?
The pact is really mostly about asylum, and it tries to deal with the Dublin regulation.
So I feel like that was a bit of a smoking gun moment for my hypothesis that this is an intentional breaking of the system. Michael McNamara was asking Helen McEntee, why isn't she transferring the people that she has permission to transfer? And her immediate reaction was to lean on the supposed inadequacies of the Dublin Convention, which she wants to change with the EU Migration Pact, and she has done for a very long time. Her immediate response was to throw the Dublin Convention into the bin, but obviously Michael McNamara is far too smart for that kind of shite. The next clip I want to show you is Michael McDougall asking the question of why is it that people are coming from the UK, where they could claim asylum, and coming to Ireland? And I think the question is answered by Helen McEntee's department's lax enforcement of the law. But let's have a look.
80% of asylum applicants or international protection applicants in Ireland are coming here via the United Kingdom. Now, I mean, we have to wise up and see why is that? Why are they coming here rather than remaining in the United Kingdom? Why are they more likely to receive a more understanding approach here than in the United Kingdom?
So Michael McDougall there asking the very valid question of, are people coming from the UK to apply for asylum in Ireland because they get a more favourable reception? And I think the rejection rates that we looked at in the previous slides show that they certainly do. The next clip will be of Helen McEntee just not enforcing the law overall. You might remember all of the people that were coming to Ireland without any passports. Thousands and thousands of them, I think roughly 10,000 of them, came to Ireland without any passport, which is a criminal offence. And Michael McNamara was asking, why aren't they being prosecuted? And eventually then suddenly they were, as soon as Michael McNamara started asking the question. So here is Michael McNamara, and we'll also have Carol Nolan and Peadar Tobin asking various instances of Helen McEntee just not enforcing the law.
You pointed out that it's an offence to present it, for the vast majority of people to present at Dublin Airport or any frontier of the state without a passport. In 2020, there were 3,285 people who did so, no prosecutions. The previous year, 4,200, no prosecutions. I asked in a parliamentary question why that was, and you said prosecutions are entirely independent. They're a matter for the Gardaí and the DPP. So then I raised it in the Dáil, and Minister Darragh O'Brien happened to be on the day. He was a bit taken aback by the question, etc. And then lo and behold, prosecutions start. And now we're told that there's loads of prosecutions. Hell for leather was quoted in the Irish Times, now so it must be true. The prosecutions are being taken. Now, my question is, what changed? Because it's the same law, same people doing the same thing. Suddenly they're being prosecuted because it's politically embarrassing for the government. How does that happen in a country where prosecutions are taken completely independently of the political system? And if the government can turn on prosecutions, well, can they also turn them off? I mean, who decided not to prosecute this?
The overall percentage of deportation orders that were affirmed or actually carried out between 2018 and May 2023 of this year was just over 11%. This means, in real terms, that just 282, 11.5%, of the 2,442 deportation orders issued were actually carried out. As commentators such as Dr. Matt Tracy have pointed out, this means that if you were presented with a deportation order by the Irish state, you have almost a 90% chance of having that order overturned and being allowed to stay here forever.
75% of people who receive a deportation order from this government never have their deportation order ever enforced, which is an incredible situation. We have a voluntary deportation system in Ireland. So after a very expensive asylum application process system, the people who are successful and the people who are not successful actually have the same outcome. This government weren't even measuring the really important statistics to help us manage this issue for the last 3 or 4 years. And that has led significantly to the crisis that we're in at the moment.
Pater Tobin is on the money there. Helen McEntee's not measuring statistics that are needed to manage the crisis contributed greatly to the crisis. But add all of that up there. So we had Michael McNamara talking about how you can arrive to Ireland without a passport and not be prosecuted. I think roughly 10,000 people did that. We've got Carol Nolan speaking about how even if you're deported, you won't actually be deported. It's a voluntary deportation system that isn't carried out. So you can come to Ireland without a passport, you can get a deportation order and not actually be deported. And as we saw in 2021, even if you got a deportation order, we might just recognise you anyway in a non-documented migrant scheme. It couldn't be more inviting. Now, the next thing I wanted to talk about is Roderick O'Gorman's infamous tweets in 8 different languages, as reported by Gript here. Roderick O'Gorman has gotten a lot of flack for this, and probably rightly so. What he did was he tweeted out a document called the End Direct Provision White Paper, which sought to replace the direct provision system in Ireland with something, I call it more luxurious. He will say maybe more of a wraparound scheme. Here's what that sounded like to Roderick O'Gorman. Interestingly enough, Roderick O'Gorman tweeted in Georgian. As we know from the last videos, Georgians are confirmed economic migrants. They've been listed as a safe country of origin since 2018. There's absolutely no need to try and entice or even risk enticing bringing more Georgians to Ireland. Why on earth would you do that?
I'm delighted to announce that we have launched the government's white paper to end direct provision and establish a new international protection support service, one that is centred on a not-for-profit approach and that has human rights at its very core. Importantly, our white paper sets out how we are going to dismantle the current system of direct provision and how we will replace it with a new system that responds to the support needs of people who come to Ireland seeking refuge. The new system of international protection and support will focus on integration from day one, and it will ensure that those who come here are supported with education and English language classes, employment activation services, appropriate healthcare, as well as housing supports. Those seeking protection will be first accommodated in a reception and integration centre where all accommodation will be own door or own room.
So that sounds very inviting, right? You've got education, wraparound supports, own door accommodation, English language classes, all fantastic. And they were tweeted out in 8 different languages, including Georgian. Now, the reason why the End Direct Provision tweets were so inviting wasn't actually down to Roderick O'Gorman. It was down to the recommendations that were set out by a group of NGOs that were led by the European Commission royalty and alumni, Catherine Day. So Catherine Day was actually hired by Fine Gael to lead a group of NGOs, the usual gang, to come up with recommendations based on best practices so that they could produce this end direct provision white paper. Here is Helen McEntee speaking about the appointment. She then handed the project to Roderick O'Gorman, who kind of acted like a fall guy in this situation.
We have committed to ending the current system of direct provision within the lifetime of the government, to replacing it with a new international protection accommodation policy, which is very much focused on a not-for-profit approach. Responsibility, as I've said, will move from my department to Minister O'Gorman's, but what we will see in the next month and a half is a report from Dr. Catherine Day, where we have asked her to bring together an expert group to make recommendations from asylum seekers and NGOs to examine best practice in other European states in the provision of services to international protection applicants, to examine likely longer-term trend and to set out recommendations and solutions. This report was due by the end of the year, but we have brought it forward so that this will be expected by the end of September. The intention then is to publish the white paper by the end of this year, informed by the recommendations of the expert group, which will set out how the replacement of direct provision will be structured and the steps to achieving this.
So Roderick O'Gorman seems to me to be somewhat of a fall guy in this situation. What we have is a EU Commission royalty-led group with NGOs, probably funded by the European Commission, to come up with a white paper that maybe coincidentally was extremely attractive to migrants to come to Ireland. The European Commission would obviously like to see Ireland in a position to opt into the EU Migration Pact. So questions have to be asked over whether or not they were motivated to create or to assist in the creation of a migrant crisis in Ireland. The next circumstance that I want you to consider when we think about the potential creation of a migrant crisis in Ireland is the family referendum. You might remember the family referendum. There was a lot of confusion over whether or not us changing the wording as to the definition of a family in our constitution would impact immigration. Our own former Attorney General, Michael McDowell, was saying that, of course, it would cause huge chaos and confusion. Leo Varadkar was saying that that was a red herring.
As you know, there are two referendums coming up on the 8th of March on family and care. We're asking you to vote yes in both referendums, but I just wanted to answer some of the queries that have been coming up through our social media. This will give more rights to migrants to bring their family here. Okay, so that's a bit of a red herring. At the moment, migrants don't have an automatic right to bring family members over to join them, and that won't change if the referendum is passed. Of course, they're all different types of migrants, and their circumstances are different depending on their status. So if somebody has a family member who's an Irish citizen, a UK citizen, an EU citizen, they can come here anyway. If somebody is here illegally, they're here illegally, so of course they couldn't bring a family member over. And if somebody is here seeking international protection, their status hasn't been determined, so they wouldn't be in a position to bring over a family member when they don't have their status or their application decided yet. None of those things will change if the referendum is passed.
So Leo Varadkar pretty clearly saying there that it won't change, or at least alluding, I think, is being quite slippery in his language. Sounded a little lawyerly to me, but he's making it clear to the public that it won't impact immigration if we vote yes to family. But Neil Richmond threw a lot more confusion on this circumstance by going on a talk show.
This is moving to not just modern time vernacular, but it has serious consequences, particularly when we think of immigration law and proving that someone is family member or family reunification. This will allow that to be accommodated as well. So we're keeping up to space with other communities.
Because you're talking about durable relationships.
Absolutely, yeah.
So hilariously enough, Neil Richmond, in Fine Gael as well, completely let the cat out of the bag on that talk show and said that it would have serious consequences on immigration. That then led to Helen McEntee having to go on the same show and contradicting him and saying he was wrong.
Your party colleague Neil Richmond said when speaking about this referendum that it has serious consequences, particularly when we think of immigration law and proving that someone is a family member or in cases of family reunification, that it will have consequences.
So our immigration law is set out by government. The family reunification law that we have at the moment is very clear and it's very narrow for specific reasons. It's between a parent and a child. That might
so
have
Neil
overall...
Richmond was wrong there, was he?
Well, yes, because this is not going to change the laws that we have now.
So thankfully, on the eve of the referendum, a letter was leaked from the Attorney General that showed that, yes, he did have concerns and others had concerns over the interpretation of durable relationships in the family definition in the Constitution. And so the referendum was defeated by quite a large margin. But the interesting thing about this referendum, which could have turned us into immigration chaos, is it was the output of the Citizens' Assembly on Gender and Equality. And the Citizens' Assembly was chaired by our good friend of the European Commission, Catherine Day. So Catherine Day was given two tasks by the 33rd Dáil and Fine Gael. One was to come up with a series of recommendations to replace direct provision, which likely contributed to our immigration crisis. And the second was to chair a group on gender and care. And that might have resulted in an immigration crisis. An immigration crisis that her previous employer and maybe current employer, the European Commission, already had a solution for and wanted a solution for it since 2015. What are the odds of that? I'll just remind you of the argument that Helen McEntee and the rest of them were making in 2024. It's purely based on the current crisis and the huge numbers that we have.
The Pact will address the key inefficiencies that are in our system, and we have a system that doesn't work as it should because it was built for much less people. We had a lot less people coming here, 3,500 applicants a year, whereas last year we had 13,000 people applying for international protection.
This European Pact provides us with the tools that we need, the laws that we need, the structures that we need.
Ireland experiences high levels of secondary movement of people who move from other safe countries before applying for asylum here. And because of this, the reforms of the Pact are essential for us.
What's clear is that our system was not designed to deal with the volume of applications far lower than we're currently dealing with, or it was designed to deal with situations far lower than we're dealing with now.
So here are some of these key events mapped against where we started. This graph of the international protection occupancy in Ireland over time. And we've put a bit more of these events on the map. So we can see that Leo Varadkar in 2018 was saying that we can't do it alone. The same line that Helen McEntee was using in 2024 when we could do it on our own. We can see that there's a series of events that happened around 2021. We have the EU Migration Pact proposed in 2020, which Simon Coveney said that no country should be able to opt out. Helen McEntee tweeted positively about the EU Migration Pact in 2020. We have the infamous 8 language tweets that occurred shortly after. And we also have the rejection rates. I think this needs to be looked into. I think the people of Ireland should vote for anybody that is towards the right, away from the European Union, until we figure out what is going on here. God bless and save Ireland. Thanks for following me all the way to the end of this video, if you're still here.